The end. If I can get a little Bill Nye with you here, in the grand scheme of things, humans haven't actually been around for all that long. We're actually a tiny blip on the cosmic timeline, and yet we have this weird fascination with how our story ends. Whether it be from floods, large space rockets, angry space aliens, wars, religious end times technology, or the trusty old zombie, we seem to be fascinated with the idea of the end and what comes next, that weird little bleed out that we call the post-apocalypse.
You said space rockets.
That's a good kind of rocket. What?
Instead of space rocks?
Who cares? And unlike in other forms of media where we can only partake in the end of days as it's presented to us, video games provide us with a more interactive experience when it comes to apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic worlds. Via controllers and keyboards, we explore wastelands, fight mutants, fend off hordes of the undead, starve and perish again and again in hundreds of different settings, all from the comfort of our couches and overly expensive computer chairs. But why? Why are there so many apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic games out there? Also, why so many gamer chairs? They all look the same, and yet none of them have cup holders. Bizarre. Turns out that's actually a fairly complicated question to answer. Both of them. Where's my cup holders? Somebody make a gamer chair with a cup holder, please. One of the more prevalent theories presented as to why we love apocalyptic games is there's a freedom and a hope with these games that we rarely get to experience in the real world. If I'm being frank, that's probably the optimistic view of it, which we'll be focusing on in this video. I tend to think it's also kind of a power fantasy. There's a lot of creepy dudes out there that think if the entire societal structure were bent and they would suddenly be king because somehow chugging a lot of Mountain Dew and being good at Halo means that you would thrive in a formless society. I don't know. A lot of dudes think that if they got to roll the dice differently that they would be a sex god. It's weird. And just as another brief aside here, this video is not going to be explicitly dealing with video games, moreover just like an extended discussion on apocalypses in general through the lens of video games. So, as many things in this world, all good ideas come from video games, so too does this video. Just warning you right off the bat, this is going to be a little more airy and philosophical than maybe what we usually post. Alright, so back to video games, or apocalypses in that matter. Society has crumbled, and for better or worse, our normal day-to-day rules no longer apply in the gaming world of the apocalypse. It's like shaking the boggle box, you get to start over. Oh yeah! Now we can do what we want and act outside of societal norms. We can take up arms to defend people, right the wrongs, and be the hero that the man is keeping us from being. Or, like I said, the sex god that feminism is preventing us from being. That one might be a little too on the nose, we'll see. And while a lot of this isn't unique to apocalyptic games, it's definitely pushed to the forefront, because a lot of games are power fantasies, big shocker. It's also important to point out this concept of freedom and hope in the ashes of a destroyed civilization is actually a very Western view of the apocalypse. Turns out we just look on the sunny side over here in the US of A. Author Dmitry Glukhovsky, who created the Metro 2033 novels and is also a writer and collaborator on the Metro series of games, spoke to VG247 about the differences in Western post-apocalyptic stories like those found in Fallout and Far Cry New Dawn, and those from Russia. I'm gonna spoil it, turns out the ones from Russia are way more depressing. But according to Glukhovsky, Russian stories tend to have a nostalgic, bleak, regretful tonality to them, adding, you fear the future because you know for sure that every tomorrow is going to be worse than every today. In other words, the Russian apocalypse is probably a bit more realistic, aka super depressing. That's just life, by the way. You know you become an adult when you understand that reality is just depressing. Meanwhile, Western apocalyptic games tend to have a feel that is a little more similar to the romanticized old Wild West of the United States. Sure, there may be no law, but genuinely people are good, and there's always going to be a good guy with a gun to shoot the bad guy with a gun. Again, probably a little too on the nose for you. And as the BBC points out, one of the benefits most of these end-of-the-world games have is that most of the antagonists are usually not human. Zombies, robots, mutilated creatures, invading aliens, space rockets, all of them make easy scapegoats and targets for the player's violence because, to put it simply, they're not like us. Yeah, turns out that's still a thing. Most people wouldn't have any qualms about taking up arms and dropping some extraterrestrial bastards coming here from parts unknown, thinking they could take our planet? Welcome to planet Earth, bitch! Population pain!
Oh yeah!
And the humans that we do deal with are easily dehumanized, either via their garb or their actions, or they're just a little brown. Again, probably too on the nose. They wear masks and bandanas to cover their faces, and they usually fit some sort of easy-to-fill stereotype, like horrible raiders coming to take our hard-earned goods, or members of a different, decidedly evil faction that just really hate freedom. In other words, the BBC and many others argue that video games use the apocalypse as a setting because it's an easy way to disconnect us from the real world and dehumanize our enemies. Those are two things that video games are all about. Turns out pretty neat hand-in-hand match there. So we can gun down and destroy hundreds and hundreds of foes without a second thought because it's the end of the world. Tough choices have to be made, slay the monsters, rebuild society, all via the barrel of a gun and a handful of rations. But I don't think they've completely nailed the reasoning there. Despite Forbes asking, why are millennials obsessed with the apocalypse, which I guess is technically a better headline than how millennials are ruining the apocalypse, this actually isn't a new fascination for humankind. It's certainly not unique to video games. The biblical parable of Noah's Ark is a well-known apocalyptic tale from the ancient world, and there are hundreds of similar tales in epic poems and religious scriptures from all over ancient times. This is something that we as a species have discussed and fantasized about for thousands of years, using whatever storytelling media was available to us at the time. Literary critic Frank Kermode, whose name definitely doesn't sound like another name for a toilet or chamber pot holder, believes that our fascination with the end of days comes from a pretty simple concept. We believe that if there is a beginning of time, there must also be an end of time. As people, we are born, we live, and we die. In our minds, the same must be true for time, or at least our concept of society. He adds, and I'm sorry, Frank, but I've got to do it, it seems to be a condition attaching to the exercise of thinking about the future that one should assume one's own time to stand in extraordinary relation to it. So that's a super fancy way of saying that not only do we believe the end of days will happen, but we as a species have this odd condition to believe it will happen in our lifetimes, that something about our period on this earth is fundamentally more important than any others that came before or will follow after. Which, if you think about it, is weirdly narcissistic and probably comes from the fact that we have a hard time grasping the sheer vastness of time and space. Our brains just aren't wired to fully comprehend it. Which is to say, to fully comprehend how inconsequential we are. But hey, us millennials are out there trying our best, huh? And I'm sorry, but we do have to drop a big actually on that whole concept. So remember that tiny blip in the cosmic timeline I mentioned way back at the beginning? Yeah, let's dive into more of that and prepare for a mind blow if you're not ready for it already. The universe is estimated to be about 14 billion years old. That number is found by measuring the age of the oldest stars we can see, measuring the speed at which the universe is expanding, and looking at the general mass density of the universe. Yes, this world has some very smart people in it. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, which is based on the radiometric dating of very old zircon rocks found in Australia. And anatomically modern humans have been wandering around for about 200,000 years, which is based on the oldest modern human skeletons found in places like Omo and Herto in Ethiopia. And yes, we are citing sources for basic measurement of the universe. You'd think that wouldn't be necessary, but there are people out there who still believe our planet is flat and only 6,000 years old, so yeah. We're all about information here. Anyway, back to the math. That means what we know as human beings have only been around for 0.004% of the lifetime of the entire planet. To put that into further perspective, if we take the timeline of the Earth and put it on a 24-hour clock, humans have only been here for the last 3.5 seconds. Taking it a step further, if we take the current oldest living person, Japan's Kane Tanaka, who is over 116 years old, and we put her life on the same time scale, her life would only be 2,000ths of a second long. That means that Kane's lifetime is 50, that's 50 times faster than the blink of an eye. So where's Gavin and a slow-mo camera when you need him? Bang, hopefully by mentioning him, we just got 1 million views on this video. I'm gonna trust you to get that, viewer. And yet, throughout human history, many have believed and foretold the apocalypse being just around the corner, which, mathematically doesn't make sense. And while somebody will be right, statistically, eventually, much like those who came before us, it's probably not happening in our lifetimes, unless that's yet another things millennials ruin, we'll see. Furthermore, we don't know what that end even looks like, unless it's, destroying the planet's ecosystem with greenhouse gases. Pretty sure about that one. But there are too many ways our time on this planet could come to an end on a long enough scale. The list we mentioned at the top barely only scratches the surface, and as time presses forward, we keep coming up and finding more ways for us to meet our collective end. It's kind of interesting. One that keeps me up randomly at night is the idea of a rogue planet passing through our solar system, and if you haven't thought about this, I'm sorry, because it's gonna be in your head for a while now. For the uninitiated, a rogue planet is a planet that is moving about our galaxy but isn't part of a star system, just floating out there by itself in the vastness of space. And sometimes these rogue planets pass through other star systems, and when that happens, it can be devastating. If a rogue planet were to pass through our solar system, even if it didn't collide with anything as it moved through, its gravitational pull on the planets, the moons, and the asteroids, the sun, could cause irreparable damage and chaos as it gently pulls everything out of the very delicate balance that holds our entire solar system together. I used to not think about rogue planets at all, and to be fair, no one really talked much about the topic until recently because our technology just reached the point where we could more easily observe and possibly track these free-floating planetary bodies as they make their way through the galaxy. So do I really expect a rogue planet to come sweeping through our solar system in my lifetime? I mean, no, not really. But it is a thought that can kind of randomly keep me up at night. What would I do? How long would I stay alive if the average temperature of the planet dropped 150 degrees in about a month? Maybe people could suddenly construct underground tunnels and be okay for maybe a month or two, but boy, it would be a sad way to go. And that seems to be the biggest trend among apocalyptic stories. Our ideas of the end of the world act as a lens or a mirror to what we see as the major threats of the times that we live in. It's a way for us to understand and cope the world around us, which is pretty morose. Turns out human beings are pretty metal. Pretty sick. For example, the stories of Noah's Ark isn't even the first telling of that particular legend. The oldest telling we have is actually found in the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Babylonian Empire.
Gilgamesh!
It follows a similar tale, only this time it's Utnapishtim who is tasked by the god Enki to build a boat, load up his family and village craftsmen, gather a ton of animals, and then ride out a massive flood. The story predates that of the biblical telling of Noah and his ark. So why all these ancient stories about a great flood? Well, archaeologists and geologists are finding evidence that there actually was a massive flood event in the area near the Black Sea thousands of years ago. And as Karen Armstrong, author of A History of God, states, if you witness a terrible natural disaster, yes, you want a scientific explanation why this has happened. But you also need something that will help you assuage your grief and anguish and rage. And it is here that myth helps us through that. The apocalyptic story of a great flood wiping out humanity, save a few true believers, acts not only as a warning, but it also helps us to provide context and understanding for those who lived in that time. Those who didn't understand why there was once a great flood and feared it might happen again. And we can see evidence of this in our media in our own times as well. From pandemics that zombify the populace in World War Z, The Walking Dead, and The Last of Us, the nuclear holocausts of Fallout, Metro, and Mad Max, the asteroid collisions of Rage, Armageddon, and I guess asteroids? Kind of, sure, you know what, let's go with it. We look at the threads around us of disease, war, and what our insurance companies call acts of God, and we try to make sense of it in our art and our storytelling. And with games, we get to stare into this dark void that most likely none of us will ever truly see in our lifetimes, but for a brief moment, it is real, and our morbid curiosity can't pull us away. Like our ancestors before us who sat around the fire and heard tales of Utnapishtim? Close enough. And the Great Flood, we now partake in these stories of our own society's demise and possible rebirth. And for a brief moment, the inevitable and uncontrollable disaster becomes easier to cope with and to understand. And that's the true glory of video games, right? Helps us digest the world around us, or maybe just shoot a guy in the head because it feels good and you want to feel powerful after taking shit from people all day at work who don't fucking tip and just leave a mess on the table for you to clean up. One or the other. It may be in equal amounts, who's to say? But hopefully you have some food for thought now. Thanks for joining us on Inside Gaming, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody. I've been thinking a lot lately about how these time loop games approach death and how it relates to gaming in general. A death is the most fundamental fail state. The two have been intertwined and conflated to the point that it's hard to separate them. I died is all but a synonym for I failed, at least in video games. It makes sense. Death translates finality pretty effectively. It's recognized across time